Hello, this is Max Mead and welcome to the Unreal Engine 4 Importing an Asset from 3ds Max tutorial here at De Montfort University's Game Art course. So the purpose of this tutorial is to show how to export an asset from 3ds Max into the Unreal Engine. So we'll be preparing the object and setting up the files in the Unreal Engine 4. Okay, so if we just open up our 3ds Max file. So this model has been kindly created by Craig Mooney on the course. And I've made a few changes to it so that I can show you how to go through the final checklist and get this asset ready so that we can actually export it. So first thing first, we need to make sure that the object's actually named properly. And the reason we do this is so that navigating through your 3ds Max scenes is easier later on. Especially if you have lots of files in the scene, it's easier to find the particular file you're looking to export. And the same goes for your materials and your textures. You need to make sure that those are all named as well. For instance, if you had 100 different materials, you wouldn't be able to find the particular one you're looking for unless they were named. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and open up the material editor and take a look at the material that we have applied to this object. So if you look at it, it may be a little bit different to what you're used to seeing, and this is because this object has multiple materials. So it has a multi-sub material plugged into the actual object. And what this does is it can apply different materials to different parts of the object depending on their material ID. And the village house project that you'll actually be creating will all be on one texture, but it's a good idea to actually know how to set up a multi-sub object. So you need to make sure that the appropriate faces of your house have the appropriate material ID. So if we just go ahead and open Polygon, and we'll just shrink down the material editor for now. So we'll drag this out so we can see what's going on. So down where it says Polygon Material ID, if I select on the top face of the house, it's Material ID 5. So if we look at our materials, we see that in the multi-sub, in the 5th slot, we have our roof material. So that lines up nicely. So let's select the wall, and the wall is Material ID 2. And that plugs into Material ID 2. So you get the drift. You need to make sure all of these are aligned properly. Okay, so everything's named, and I'm pretty happy with that. So let's move on. The next thing we need to make sure is the scale set up correctly. Unreal uses one 3ds Max unit to one scale unit in Unreal Engine. So this can mean that 1 centimeter can equal 1 unit, or 1 inch can equal 1 unit. It depends on how 3ds Max is set up. Generally speaking, we want to use centimeters because it's a lot easier to work from than trying to work out how many inches something is. Also, just by reference, the character height in Unreal is 190 centimeters high. Now that's quite high. It's about 6'6". But to make everything keep within a set scale, we're gonna work to that. So we're gonna work as if our door height is 190 centimeters high. So we'll look at that in a second. Let's just set up our scale and make sure everything's all right. So we need to go down to Customize in the top toolbar, Unit Setup, and we're just going to go straight to System Unit Setup, and we're going to make sure that this is set to 1 unit equals 1 centimeter. So nice simple scaling. I think by default it is probably set to inches, so you just need to make sure that you change that to centimeters. Press OK, and we want to make sure that display unit scale is also set to metric and centimeters, and this is so that when we create a box it is actually so many centimeters high. It's not giving you a different readout, and it makes it easier to work from. Okay, so let's press OK. So next we need to look at this at the pivot, sorry. And you'll notice at the moment that our object's pivot is way off in the top sort of left hand corner, and that's no good for us. If we try to import this in into 3ds Max, you find that your cursor would be the point where your pivot would be. So if we were placing this on the floor, only the very top part of this house would actually be popping out. So generally speaking, we want to actually make the pivot on the bottom face. And the reason we do that is so that when we're placing it in Engine, it places firmly on the floor, and everything is visible, and you don't have to actually make a lot of changes to the house to make it work. Okay, so let's go ahead and explain how to actually change your pivot. So I'm just going to go into the front viewport here, and before we do anything, I'm just going to drag the house down, and I'm just going to make sure that the bottom edge of the house lines up with this x-axis of the grid. So the x-axis is, so this middle point here is world 000. So if we exported our object over here, we'd find that when we was placing it in, the object would actually be miles to the right. So we want to make sure that it's in the center of our world. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and go to hierarchy and effect pivot only, center pivot. The center is centering it to the middle of the whole object. So that can be useful for some objects, but for a house, we want to be able to place this from the bottom. So we're just going to go ahead and hit the y-axis in this case and drag it down so it just lines up nicely with the bottom of the house. Okay, and don't worry about it being in the center. We're gonna reset all of that anyway. So click off of effect pivot only so we can go ahead and work on the object. And where it says X, Y, and Z, we just want to go ahead and right click on the arrows. And right clicking basically sets these values to 0. And because we've got the move tool on, it's going to move it. It's not going to scale it or rotate it. So we're just going to hit 0 on all of those. And now you'll find that this pivot point is right in the middle of our scene. It's right in the middle of 000. So now when we import that in, it will import nicely right where we actually want to place it in Unreal Engine. Okay, so the final thing that we're going to do before we export this is just reset the X-form. Now the X-form is an important step of taking something into the engine, and you can find that the X-form will actually affect things like your unwrap and the way that your tools actually work. So sometimes it's good to actually reset your X-form often when you're making things, especially if you're adding objects together. And the reason we're resetting the X-form is if we try to import this asset into the engine and something was underlyingly wrong with the X-form, you'd find that it'd be scaled like either really small or in one direction, and that's obviously not something that we want. So we're going to go, we've already pressed reset selected, so we're just going to go to the modify tab, and we actually need to make this this X-form collapsed. So we need to right click on the X-form and collapse to. And what this will do is it will just get the asset, the X-form reset. And we can check the X-form by looking at the bounding box by pressing J on the keyboard. And we can see that actually that looks fine. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about how to export this to Engine. Okay, so to actually export this to Engine, we need to go up to the Start sort of tab of 3ds Max, and we need to go down to Export. And we don't want to just click Export, because if we have other objects in the file, it will try and export everything in the scene. Obviously, we only want to export this one particular house, so we're going to click on this little arrow to the side, and we're going to go and hit Export Selected. And what this will do, by default, it goes to your C drive where 3ds Max export is selected, and obviously that's probably not a great place to actually save your files, and we want to save those wherever we particularly want to grab them from later on. So my particular ones, I'm gonna go onto the G drive, admin, game production. We're just going to create a new folder, Okay, so we double click on that and we're just going to name it again. So we're just going to call this village house. And I haven't got any other village house at the moment, so we're just going to call it 01. And it's important again, like I said in the previous video, to make sure everything's named correctly and named so that you can actually find it later on. And because our village isn't that big, I can just call this village house 01 because it's a regular house. Let's go and hit save and make sure it's saved as autodesk.fbx. And FBX is the file format that we're actually going to be using to bring it into Unreal Engine. And it has some advantages that we can talk about as we do. One of the great things that it actually does is you can export the materials with your file, so it'll actually load them up along with the actual object in Unreal Engine. So that can save you a lot of work of actually exporting the textures independently, and it should apply all to your mesh in the same sort of areas. So it saves you quite a bit of work. And I'll go over how to do that now, and I'll also go over how to import materials separately as well. So we're just going to click on geometry, and we're going to make sure we click on smoothing groups, tangents and binaural. We'll tick off turbo smooth because we're not using that. And that should be everything. Everything else is fine there. Okay, so that's fine. Let's go ahead and press OK. So there you go, it's exported. Doesn't take long. Let's go ahead and open up the Unreal Engine and see if we can get this working. Okay, so let's create a new project. Again, I'm just going to go to Blueprint First Person. And I'm going to go ahead and hit exporting tutorial. Okay, create project. Oh, that's great. Let me just fix that and I'll come back. Okay, sorry about that. The editor crashed, but bear in mind that this is still in beta, so it hasn't actually been fully released yet, so you can expect it to crash sometimes. So I've gone ahead and opened that level I've just created. And I've deleted the boxes and the first person sort of template that we didn't want to see those right now. So I've just got sort of a blank map that we can work from. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're going to create a new folder like we did in the previous video. And we're just going to call this export tutorial. And I'm going to create a new folder called assets. A new folder called textures. And a new folder called materials. So it's good to segment all of these. I said double click on assets. So to import and export an asset from 3ds Max, we just want to go to import, this big button at the top. And we need to find where we saved this. So wherever you saved it, navigate to there. I'm just going to find my one. Okay, Village House 01 FBX. Great. So we've double clicked that to open it up. So it's going select asset type. So it's auto detected that this is just an ordinary static mesh. It's not a character, so it's not a skeleton, and it's not an animation. We want to make sure we under LOD group. So LOD stands for level of detail. We want to make this level architecture, so it's always important. It's never going to actually disappear in our scene when we get further away. So, for instance, for like maybe if you had like a can of drink on the floor, and you didn't want to see it obviously from like a mile away, you could make sure that it was just like decoration. So that would disappear a lot sooner than any of the other ones. So we're going to make sure we hit level architecture. Under normals, we're going to hit import normals because we have normals that actually apply to this. And we're just going to tick on to advanced. We're going to make sure we combine meshes. I mean, this depends on if you're exporting multiple objects, but for our particular mesh, we want it all to be one object. We haven't got any LEDs, so we don't need to actually import those. Don't need to worry about vertex colors, and we want to remove degenerates because this can cause our object to actually fail importing if we have these sort of random verts and faces that aren't actually achieving anything. So remove degenerates. Okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier, that we can actually import the materials straight from 3ds Max. So if you set up your materials correctly, so if we go into materials, we have a multi-sub, and we have material with a texture going into diffuse color. So if we had textures going into different slots of these, it would try and import those all and create the material for you. If you don't have anything applied, then obviously you don't actually need to click that on at all. But we're going to go ahead and hit import materials and import textures. And the reason we're doing that is so that we don't actually have to import those separately. And I will go over how to import those separately later on. Okay, so that is everything. So we just want to go ahead and hit import all, because we're only importing one thing. And just wait for that to work. And the reason it's taking so long is because it's importing multiple objects, multiple materials and textures. So obviously it needs to work through all of those. Okay, so you'll find that now everything that you had assigned to that particular object is now imported into the scene. So it's great. We've got multiple textures here, and it's actually set up our materials for us, which is really helpful. And bear in mind, your house is probably only going to have one texture on it, so you'll only have sort of one material and one texture along with your house, so it's going to be a lot easier for you to understand. So if we this is our asset here. Obviously we can see it through the little preview window, but if we roll over it, it says static mesh, and it's also coloured in sort of a turquoise colour. Your materials are coloured in green, and your textures are coloured in red. So if we left click and drag that into the scene, we actually it's all already applied, so that's great. We don't have to do anything. We can go ahead and press play, and we can actually run around this, and we can shoot through it. And the reason we're shooting through it is because it doesn't have any collision. We need to make that. Okay. So let's say that some of these materials actually didn't export, or we wanted to export new ones. So let's go ahead and we'll delete the roof. So we'll delete that texture and delete that. Okay, so it's we've properly deleted it from the engine, so it's actually taken it off of our mesh, and now we have sort of this checkerboard material on. Okay, so we need to go ahead and add stuff in. So I'm just going to go ahead and move all of these files into their appropriate folders, so it's better organized. So I'm going to move the materials into the material folder under our export tutorial. If I drag those over by pressing Control to select all of them and left clicking and dragging, I can go ahead and press move here because I only want to move them to that folder. Okay, so I've moved everything over, so everything's within its proper folder structure. So I have materials in their material folder and your textures in your texture folder. So let's talk about how to actually import a texture on its own. So we're going to go ahead and hit import again, and we're going to navigate to where our textures are saved. So my textures are saved in village house textures, and we just want to find our roof texture. village house roof underscore D for diffuse. So I'm just going to drag that. We're going to double click that. It's just telling us it's building the texture. Okay, so that's a really simple way of just bringing in a new texture, and we can do this for literally any texture we've created. So just double click on that and make sure it's all set up properly. So yeah, its compression is DC default, and that's great. For instance, if you're bringing in a normal map later on, you'd want to make sure that you tick your compression to a certain type, and we can actually turn on compression with alpha without alpha, sorry, because this doesn't have an alpha texture, and basically it will make the texture less memory intensive. So let's go ahead and click alpha. Okay, so save that. Okay, so we have our texture created here. And we can actually create the material by just dragging that on to the faces that we want to apply it to. So for instance, this material ID, and it will apply it to the whole or every face that has that material ID. So if we go ahead and do that, what it will do is it will create a material, because we can't use a texture as a material. We need to create a material. For the same reason in 3ds Max, if we look at how that's set up, we have a texture going into a material, and the material is what plugs into the object. So same principle with Unreal. So we have our material created there. So if we just click off and we click on the house, we can see that all the elements now have their materials assigned. We can create a material from scratch as well. So if we go ahead and delete that one. Okay, so the material is gone again. We can go ahead and right click on that, and we can go create material, and what this will do is it will create material from that texture. So I'm just going to drag that into materials. Oh, I did the wrong one. Okay, so if we go ahead and we'll open that up. So this is what I'm talking about, the slate material editor. Looks sort of very similar to this. So to navigate around this, we can hold down the right mouse button to pan, and left click and drag, obviously, will drag objects around. So we can drag all of these around to create some more space for us. Okay, so this is our texture plugging into the base color of our object. You have different settings here, and we're actually not going to be using any of these at the moment. Though we do want to plug a constant into our specular value, and that's because we don't want this sort of shine, because it doesn't fit in with the style of our asset we're actually creating. Because it's sort of a very diffuse, flat lit, stylized piece, we're not going to have sort of realistic lighting situations on it. So we're going to press 1 and click on the page, left click, and what this will do is it will create a 1 constant. We can actually find this as well if we go to this the palette at the side, and we can type in, and we can go to constant. So you have constant, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can have 1 constant, which is the one we want, because we only want to have one particular value. And to assign this into one of these slots, we can left click on this sort of node piece here, left click and drag, and we want to drag that into the specular. So now you'll see that it doesn't have that sort of horrible lighting, though it is still getting lit sort of naturally by the light. But you're not having any sort of fall off or point light information on it. So go ahead, save, because that's all we need to do for now. Okay, and we can actually apply that another way to the material, to the object. So we can either click on the object here, or we can click on the asset in the actual content browser. And we want to apply it to element 4, because this is where our roof is. So you go to materials, we're going to select village house roof material, and we're not going to drag it on like I showed you earlier on. We can use a selected asset from the content browser. Because we've got the material selected, it will actually use that if we press this button. And there you go. So the material is now all applied, and you'll notice that because we've changed that material a little bit, it's not actually picking up sort of the sort of shiny lights that we actually want to try and avoid for this piece. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and change the rest of those materials so that they perform the same way. Okay, so we have our object in the scene, and you'll notice now that it's all being flatly lit. It's fitting in with the style that we actually want to achieve for this object. So there's a couple of other things to actually make this fully sort of realized in the Unreal Engine. And what I was talking about in the previous video is that you have to build your lighting. So to actually get the proper shadows, we need to make sure we build everything. So we have sort of this preview lighting in at the moment, but we want to go ahead and set up the light map channel. Okay, so I'm going to go back to 3ds Max, and this isn't sort of a necessary part for your actual hand in, but it is a necessary part if you're ever going to be creating something properly within Unreal. And to do this, we need to create a second light map channel, so a second unwrap. It's not going to affect the actual look of our model, but it's merely going to be used to save in that lighting information. So we're going to go to the modifier list, and in the same way that we created the original unwrap, we're going to go to unwrap UVW and open up the UV editor. So this is what our unwrap looks like at the moment for this object. So it's all sort of on top of each other with loads of different maps inside of it. So we want to go and make a second UV channel. So where it says channel, map channel, we want to hit up on this little slider, and generally speaking, you probably want to move your UVs from the original, just so it's a little bit easier to pack. I'll show you the unwrap that I've already created for this object. So I'm just going to go ahead and press abandon. Okay. So this is what our unwrap looks like for the light map. So each face has its own particular space, so nothing's overlapping, and that's important because the light maps can't stack on top of each other, obviously. So if you have one piece in dark and it's stacked up on a face that's going to be lit, then you're going to have sort of bad results, and you're going to have sort of like a patchy look to your model with the lighting. So everything's got its own individual space. It's got a little bit of a gap between it to allow for the fall off of the light as well. It's a little bit tedious to actually do, but it just involves a sort of careful UV packing. You can use sort of a flattened map to get everything to sort of the same scale, and then you can move stuff around to fill in some of these gaps. So let's go ahead and just delete that for a sec, and we're going to sort of, I'll show you the process that you'll actually have to go through. So our original unwrap, we just want to go to map channel 2, and we want to hit move. Okay, so we're now in our second unwrap, and we've still got the same sort of UVs. So you can go ahead and hit rescale elements and then pack. And what you want to do is you basically want to tidy this up so we're not sort of like wasting all of this space in between. And make sure areas that are larger obviously have more UV space that are more important. So you want to sort of pack those out like nicely, and when it's done, you want to go ahead and hit collapse. And I'm not going to do that because I've obviously got my UVs actually saved already. So I want to go to and make sure that if you're actually doing any changes to your UV unwrap, that when you go back into it, you make sure that you go to map channel and you press abandon, so you're actually using your second map channel, because otherwise it will keep moving it from the first channel to the second channel,
and overwriting the work you've done. So make sure you collapse between each time you're changing between these, and make sure that once you've created your light map channel, you only ever press abandon to travel between them, because you don't want to overwrite the work. Okay, so we'll collapse that down. And for sort of more complicated assets, you want to also make sure that your smoothing groups are applied. So there's no smoothing groups on this at the moment, but because the faces are all sort of split up into individual pieces, you don't actually notice. But for other assets, you definitely notice that your smoothing groups aren't applied. So we're just going to clear all, and we're just going to auto smooth that for now. And if we had any sort of bad results, we could go ahead and change those independently. Okay, so we've got our unwrap all sorted, so we can go ahead and export this again. So click on the asset we've done and hit yes. Everything should be the same, so just press OK and open up Unreal. So to import our sort of changed asset, we can go to where it's saved, right click on that, and we just go and hit re-import. So basically it won't update automatically unless you tell it to. So we've saved that again, so it knows where that's saved. We're going to re-import it, and it should just re-import any changes that you've made. So double click on that, and we need to make sure we set this up so that the light map channels actually work. So we don't want to look at the materials, so we're just going to clear that for now. But where it says static mesh settings, we want to do some changes here. So I'm just going to hit this drop down menu, and where it says light map coordinates index, that is referencing where your unwrap is actually being taken from. And the confusing or the most confusing part about this is that your light map coordinates index 1 is actually your second unwrap channel. Unreal Editor actually uses 0 as the first light map, the first unwrap, and 1 as the second, rather than 1 and then 2. So a normal texture would be on light map coordinates 0, and light map would be on coordinates 1. So we can have a look at the UVs. So this is for channel 0. And obviously that's all overlapping, so we can just turn that off. And the last thing we were going to change is the light map resolution. At the moment, this is these are power of 2 textures. So at the moment, this whole building is squeezing onto a tiny 32 pixel wide by 32 pixel high texture sheet. And obviously, the light map bake for that is going to be pretty terrible. In fact, I'll show you sort of what it'll actually look like. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to build the lighting. I'm just going to build it in medium, just so we have a little bit of test. It's not full sort of resolution scale. So, and so I'll just let that build. And it does it nice and quickly because there's only one thing in the scene. Okay, so obviously this is what I was talking about the problem. Because the light map resolution is so low, obviously the smaller parts of our unwrap aren't actually even going to fit into a pixel, so you're going to have lots of light bleeding and random sort of shadows and edges. So you need to make sure that your light map is appropriately large for your object. So we're going to open it up again, and we'll want to change this to let's say a 512, and it doesn't need to be quite as big as your actual texture sheet, but big enough for the lighting to look nice and crisp. So save that, and I'm going to build that again. And because I've changed it, it's gone back to preview mode. Okay, so it takes a little bit longer because it has to change the light map size. Okay, so that's basically now what our lighting looks like with a higher resolution. It's a lot more crisp, and everything has its own space, so nothing sort of looks out of place. Okay, so that is pretty much the basics of importing into Unreal. I mean, I'll do a few more detailed tutorials later on how to set up materials and visual effects. But thank you for listening, and good luck.